So anyway, so my name is Matthew March. I'm the ag agent, AgriLife Extension agent over here in Polk County, so a little bit east of y'all, northeast of y'all in Livingston. Um, but tonight I'm going to be covering Texas ecoregions, and it's a kind of a fun talk. I kind of enjoy doing this, but before we kind of go into the fun part, so I'm going to show y'all a lot of pictures tonight. We're just going to kind of take a road trip across Texas. But before that, I want to kind of talk about what an ecoregion is. So with that being said, I put up several different definitions on the slide. I'm not going to go over all of these. Kim, I'm sure it's all right with you. I'll email you a PDF version of the slides tomorrow, and you can send that out to the group so they can have this for their information. Yep. So here's just a variety of definitions, but as you can kind of glance through them, an ecoregion is kind of basically a loose term we use for a area of likeness. So depending on what you are, depends on what you're going to define an ecoregion as. So if you're like a forester, you're going to look at an ecoregion as an area that has similar trees or similar type of forest. A geologist is going to look at an area that has similar rocks or similar geological things that have caused the soil and rocks in that area. Me personally, I focus more. I come from a wildlife background, so I look more at the wildlife and the habitat out there. So a biologist would look at areas that have similar wildlife. So it kind of depends where you're going at it. But so when we look at the drivers of ecoregion, I got kind of the top categories up here. So we got temperature, precipitation, soil, hydrology. So that's going to be water, geography, altitude. People don't think of this a lot, but elevation has a big impact on the habitat and the wildlife. Macroclimate. So that's going to be how do I describe this? Would be like an area far inland has a different climate than an area next to an ocean. And then obviously oceans affect, if you're right next to an ocean, you might have more rainfall than an area 100 miles inland. But with all that being said, as you can see, I bolded the top two, temperature and precipitation. Those two, in my opinion, probably have the biggest driver on defining the characteristics of an ecoregion. And that kind of makes sense. Precipitation, obviously, more rainfall is going to lead to more flora, more plant growth. And temperature, obviously, if it's subarctic where it's freezing all the time, then you're going to have plants and animals used to living in frigid temperatures compared to a tropical type region. And we're going to look at that a lot when we take our road trip across Texas here later in the presentation. And you're going to see how the temperature and precipitation gradient in Texas really affects our ecoregions. So going right into that, you can see here's a precipitation map of Texas. And most of y'all probably know this, but just to remind you, as you go, obviously further east in the states, a lot wetter than the far west parts of the state. So we have an east to west gradient across Texas as far as our precipitation goes. So as you can see in southeast Texas, we're pushing 60 inches of rain a year compared to our driest county in the state, which is going to be El Paso County, way out in far west Texas, where they get about 6 to 8 inches, and that might come once every year and a half or 2 years, or just in 1 or 2 rainfalls a year. So, obviously that should go without saying. When you get 8 inches of rain compared to 60 inches of rain, that's going to have a big impact on what plants and wildlife live in that area. And then when you're looking at ecoregions from like a wildlife biologist perspective or a diversity perspective like I do, then that's going to have an impact on that. And just out of curiosity, I guess I should point out, because y'all are in Heartwood, so that's Walker and Montgomery County. So that's going to be just, that's kind of be in that darker bluish green to light green areas. So you're looking at, 38 to 42 inches of rain roughly. So And y'all know that, we get a lot of rain here in Southeast Texas. So one thing that probably doesn't show up quite as much as an impact on ecoregions, but as the east to west precipitation gradient in Texas, but it does somewhat is our south to north temperature gradient. So as you can see on this map, this is what we call a USDA cold hardiness zone map. And if any of y'all are gardeners on the call, y'all probably know that they updated this a few months ago. So this is, I do apologize, this is the old map. So basically our winters have gotten warmer, so all these colors have kind of moved northward by about 100 miles or so. But I don't know, I still think you should go with the old one, especially since in Texas, as we know, we can have some pretty erratic cold winters. But basically what this map is showing, it's showing the potential for how cold it can get in the wintertime. And so you should plant plants that are adapted to those cold temperatures. So I know we're talking about ecoregions here, but the same thing can be said. Plants in the northern part of the state are adapted to grow in temperatures down to negative 10 degrees Fahrenheit compared to in the lower Rio Grande Valley where it doesn't even hardly freeze. So basically in Texas, when you get up in the far northern reaches of the Panhandle, you're looking at a very temperate climate where you have a really distinct 4 seasons. Compared that down into the far southern reaches of the lower Rio Grande Valley where they're basically subtropical. And if you went about 100 miles further south into Mexico, you would basically call it a tropical climate where there's really not a winter. Temperatures are pretty steady all year long. So that's I think that's all I got to say on that. And if y'all got any questions, I'm not really looking at the chat. Y'all can just chime in and stop me or type something in the chat. And maybe Kim will stop me. So this is where if we were in person, I kind of asked the people questions, but I know it's kind of hard over a Zoom meeting.
What is
but I would ask y'all, what do y'all think Texas is? Do you think it's a northern state, a southern state, an eastern state, a southern state, a western state? Where does it fall kind of in our perception of the United States? And usually when I ask this in a room full of people, I guess it kind of depends on what part of the state you fall into, but a lot of people will say a southern state. Some people will say a southwest or a western state. And then even if you go up into the Panhandle, a lot of those people actually consider themselves part of the Midwest because they have a lot of similar characteristics to the Midwestern part of the country. So what I'm saying with that is if y'all probably ever heard the saying before, we like to brag in Texas. We call ourselves the best state out of the union, and we say Texas is like a whole nother country. Well, it really is. It's unique compared to all the other states that we're so big and we have such a precipitation and temperature gradient. We have a whole wide range of ecoregions in this state compared to other parts of the country. And I'm going to talk about that more in a minute. So this is a biome map of the world, and most of y'all probably know what a biome is, but if you don't, a biome is basically kind of a step up from an ecoregion. So a biome would be a very broad scale area that has similar characteristics. So a good example of that would be a tropical rainforest biome. So tropical rainforest biome would include parts of South America and the tropical parts of Africa. And then another good example of biome would be like the Arctic is one biome. So if you kind of focus in on Texas on this part of the map, I wanted to pull this up because you can see according to this biome map, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different major biomes in Texas alone. That's pretty impressive when you compare that to other parts of North America or other countries. I mean, I'm just going to pick out a random country here, not picking on anybody, but I'm looking at Spain right now and I see Spain has 2 biomes and Texas has 6. I mean, so, we really have a plethora of biomes and ecoregions in Texas alone. So here's just another map, a little close up in North America. This biome map shows a little bit different, but it basically shows we have about 5 major biomes in Texas. So, and it follows that precipitation and temperature gradient. So when you start off in the east, you have evergreen forest and kind of that pine belt that goes all the way through the south. Then you get into our oak forest, and then as the temperature drop or as the rainfall starts to limit, we get into our grasslands, and then eventually into deserts in far west Texas. And a lot of people would actually be surprised to know this, but several of the highest mountain ranges in far west Texas actually have quite a bit of the same characteristics as the Rocky Mountains. And some sources even consider some of the highest ranges in West Texas to actually be part of the Rocky Mountains. So, but either way, so Texas has all the major biomes in North America except the chaparral, which is like Mediterranean. That's what you see in California. Coastal forest, which would be the Pacific Northwest. And then obviously we don't have tropical rainforest. And y'all all know we get plenty hot in Texas, so we don't have any polar bears or ice floating around, so we're not in the Arctic. But like I said, Texas is like its own other country that we have deciduous forest, grasslands, desert, and montane forest. And you might hear me refer to that a few times. So montane forest is basically when you get in these high mountain ranges where the mountains get tall enough that it affects the temperature and precipitation, so it gets additional rainfall that allows for trees to grow. So I kind of touched on this already, but as we take our road trip across Texas, we're going to go east to west and north to south, and you're going to kind of see these trends. So we're going to go from pine forest to the east, then oak or deciduous forest, then tall grass prairie, then mid-grass prairie, then short grass prairie, and desert.
Matthew, can I ask a question?
Sure, ask me all the questions y'all want.
So I've spent a lot of time in the Guadalupe Mountains, and people believe that that's the tail end of the Rockies. Is that the way you feel that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a geologist, but I mean, I personally have been to the Guadalupe Mountains, and you get it up in some of them back canyons. It looks very similar to what we would consider the Rocky Mountains in New Mexico. Depending on the source, some of the same, and like I said, I'm not a geologist at all, but some of the formations that rose up the Guadalupe Mountains was the same geological activity that caused the Rocky Mountains. So that's where that association comes into. When we look at most of our other mountain ranges in West Texas, they have very similar animal and plant life as the Guadalupe Mountains, but our other mountain ranges were created by volcanic activities, so that separates them from the Rocky Mountains. But yeah, that's a good point, Tom. And I'm going to show y'all some pictures of the Guadalupe Mountains here later in the presentation. And
thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And if y'all have never been there, I highly recommend it. It's one of my favorite places in Texas. And when y'all see some of these pictures, you will be surprised that are actually in Texas. But so I was going to mention, so the difference between tall grass, mid-grass, and short grass prairie kind of goes without saying, but I just like to point this out, that obviously that's affected by rainfall, but tall grass prairie is what we consider a grassland, ungrazed in its natural state, would grow between about 3 to 6 feet tall. Mid-grass prairie would be about 12 to 24 inches, so 1 to 2 feet. And short grass prairie, we're looking like 4 to 6 inches. I just want to point that out. And then north to south, we talked about more tropical fauna in the south, and then plants and animals in the far reaches of the panhandle, more adapted to freezing temperatures. So here's,
hey,
I believe,
Matthew.
Yes.
Matthew, it's Tammy Sinclair. I'm just wondering if besides Texas, is there another state in the U.S. that has as many climates as we do within
No, you could argue California has quite a few different ecoregions and different climates, but a lot of those are very similar over there. I mean, they're not similar, but a lot of those, you have a lot of different mountain ranges and desert type climates over there, and then the coastal chaparral and the redwoods. So California would definitely be up there with level of diversity. Uh, Alaska has quite a few different ecoregions also, but when you look at major biomes, most of those all fall into just your Arctic or your boreal forest. So that's just your northern woods, and then your Arctic climate. So when you look at Texas really having about 5 major biomes that intersect in the state, it really is unique amongst the other states. Especially, I mean, you have your huge chunk in the middle part of the country. That's going to be just all plains. So the middle part of the country is just one biome, and then the far eastern part of the country is just all oak woods or deciduous woods. So Texas is definitely unique in that fact.
Thank you.
Yep, and I would argue we're not going to really talk about it today too much, but for most major classes of vertebrae and probably insects and stuff too, you see the highest number of diversity in Texas, especially mammals, reptiles, and we lead the country in birds. We have I think we have about 200 or so more bird species than any other state, so we're up there. But here comes the fun part of the presentation. So we're going to take a road trip across Texas, and I'm going to go through, let me back up. I'm going to go through all the major ecological regions, and this is the map that I think's in y'all's textbook and what the Master Naturalist wants y'all to train on. So this is Gold's Ecoregions of Texas, and this is kind of the standard that most people go off of. And it does a pretty good job. You'll see different maps with different representations, but this is a pretty good one. So as we go through Gold's ecological regions, I'm going to talk about each one. I'm going to show a lot of pictures. I'm going to talk a little bit about land use and some characteristics. I think it's important for y'all to know that most ecoregions in Texas have been altered one way or another by humans, and kind of talk about, what we do on them now and how it benefits to us as society. And then we're going to talk about plants and animals and just what the landscape looks like. So we're going to go east to west. So starting off in the east, most of y'all probably know, most of y'all being around Conroe and Huntsville area, that we're in the Piney Woods ecoregion. So the Piney Woods, and let me see. Yeah, I called it the Piney Woods here. Sometimes you'll also see this called the South Central Plains, but in Texas, we just call it the Piney Woods. But it's basically part of that pine belt or that South Central Plain that extends all across the South from Louisiana all the way up to the southern parts of Virginia. So we're that far western edge of that pine belt. And it basically starts in northeast Texas, about Texarkana, and then swings down to the southwest. And Tyler is going to be right on the edge of that, and that's going to be in Smith County right in the middle. And then it kind of follows that Trinity River down into down just north of Huntsville, and then kind of swings west over to north of Houston, and then goes along the coast back east. So that's the Piney Woods. And the Piney Woods is basically an extension of I already said that, extension of the southern pine belt. It tends to be pretty flat and level down in our neck of the woods in the southern part of it. When you get up north of Tyler and around Texarkana, it actually has some decent hills up there. And so just a note of that. Piney Woods is marked by having very sandy and acidic soils. And the reason why I pointed that out here is most of y'all probably know Texas has a lot of rock in it. And if I was here in person, I'd ask y'all to guess, but I'm not going to ask y'all to do that. But that rock in most parts of Texas is limestone. Well, limestone tends to make the soil alkaline. So everywhere else in Texas, they're pretty much dealing with alkaline soils. But in East Texas, we have acidic soils, which impacts what plants we can grow. And that's one reason why we have a pine forest. It's mostly forest land. We do see some crop land up in the northeast parts of it, up around the Red River Valley and towards Texarkana. But historically, we're talking like pre-Civil War, we would have had upland pine savannas that would have been fire dominated. We would have had very open canopies, and then we would have had dense hardwood bottomlands. We had longleaf belt. I'll go back up here. So I'll spend a little bit of time on the Piney Woods because I know this is the ecoregion that y'all live in mostly. But we had we have three native pine trees in Texas. We have the shortleaf, the loblolly, and the longleaf. So historically, the loblolly would have been mainly found south of the line from about Walker to the southern half of Polk County and then over to Jasper and Newton. So kind of that southern third of the piney woods. And the loblolly grows really good in kind of flat, flooded type bottomland. Then you had the shortleaf pine kind of north of Nacogdoches County. And the shortleaf pine is more adapted to kind of them upland rolling hills. And then smack dab in the middle of them, you had the longleaf pine ridge on that real sandy land ridge that you see running from Trinity, Polk, and then over to Sabine County. So that kind of historically, our pine trees were more separated than they are now. I mean, historically, you probably would have found all three species kind of throughout the piney woods, but they all kind of had their niches where they dominated in. So here's some pictures of the piney woods. The one on the left is the Angelina National Forest. They're south of Lufkin, and it kind of shows you that's not the best example of an open pine savanna, but it shows you what it historically more would have looked like in our part of the state. You would have been able to see across it and walk through it a lot easier than nowadays, where most of it's overgrown with yopon and other understory brush. The picture on the right, that's going to be Caddo Lake, and that's Texas's only man-made natural lake, and I put that in quotation marks. It was natural. I probably said man-made and natural in the same sentence, and I apologize. It's Texas's only major natural lake, and it was natural because it was farmed by a log jam, but that log jam is long gone, and there's now a dam there to keep it there. So, I mean, it's pretty much a man-made lake at this point. But I put Caddo Lake in here because this is the part of the state where we have a lot of water, so we have our highest diversity of fish life and aquatic vegetation around here. So some other animals to note, I'll just start on the top left, and we'll go clockwise. So that's the red cockaded woodpecker. That's a protected species that we find here in East Texas and across the South. And the reason why it's protected is it needs very old pine trees to nest in. It needs them nesting cavities. As you can see, it's utilizing there. Excuse me. And we harvest our trees too young now for them pine trees to get to them big nesting cavities. Thankfully, the red cockaded woodpecker is doing really good, and they downgraded it, I believe, from endangered to threatened a couple years back because of we've established a lot of colonies in national forests, so their population's looking up. The picture in the middle is a picture of pine trees. It's kind of hard to tell in the slide, but all three pictures of all three native pines in Texas are actually in that picture. So there's a short leaf on the left, there's a long leaf in the middle with the big long needles, and then there's a loblolly hiding behind both of them. Top right, that's going to be a paddlefish. That's kind of a unique fish that you only find in the piney woods of Texas. It's pretty much was native east of the Trinity River. And this guy, it's harvested actually for caviar in certain parts of the country. I don't think that's too big. It's not harvested commercially here in Texas. But this fish basically swims around with its big mouth open, and it eats algae and plankton out of the water. Something that's been around, I think, since the age of the dinosaurs, as you can kind of tell by the way it looks. The bottom right, that's going to be a pine snake, a Louisiana pine snake. It is a subspecies or a close relative of just a bull snake, but the Louisiana pine snake is highly endangered, and it's associated with the longleaf pine savanna and the fire that went along with that. Not that it needed the fire, it doesn't need fire to survive, but it thrives in that kind of habitat by creating a grassland where it can find its food source. And it basically lives underground in gopher tunnels, and they're very hard to see. And there's been just a handful of individuals captured in Texas in the last 20 years and a few more in South Central Louisiana. But basically, we're down to about 3 or 4 colonies, especially here in Texas, and they're all in Sabine County for the most part. And then bottom left is just going to be a box turtle. We have quite a bit of reptiles and amphibians here in East Texas. And the one in the bottom left, that's a 3-toed box turtle. So moving further west, we get out of the green and we go kind of to this maroon color. And that's going to be what we call our post oak savanna. And our post oak savanna is basically, it's the trees that can survive in less water or with less rainfall, but you can find them in the piney woods. So let me rephrase that real quick. It's a lot of our most hardiest oak trees that survive in the post oak savanna. And the main species is post oak, hence the name post oak savanna. Also blackjack oak, a couple hickories, but the same trees that you can find in the post oak savanna, you can find in the piney woods. It's just that we get too far, it gets too dry further west for the pine trees to survive. So the piney woods, or the post oak savanna, excuse me, basically starts up there in the just west of the piney woods, up there along the Red River and Bowie County, and it extends down in the strip just east of Dallas. Just east of Dallas, and then it goes across the Trinity River. So you're really your only major town in the post oak savanna is going to be College Station. It's the post oak savanna is just west of y'all there in Montgomery County. Far western reaches of Montgomery and Walker County actually are in the post oak savanna, just the tips of them. And then the post oak savanna extends just to the east of Austin, San Marcos, New Braunfels, and San Antonio. So we're basically looking east of that I-35 corridor, but west of the piney woods. So I kind of talked about it's a western extension of the pine belt without the pine trees. One unique characteristic about the post oak savanna is it has very sandy soils that are underlined by a clay pan. So for any of y'all gardeners listening on here, y'all probably know that is about as poor of a soil that you can get to try to grow something in, because you have sand that won't retain water, so your water just doesn't stay at the top, and then you got a clay pan underneath it to where the water won't soak in. So the soil is pretty terrible in this part of the state. Because of that, farming has never been a major part of this part of the state, and it's been mainly used as rangeland, and cattle have just been allowed to graze. We do have some improved pasture where they've gone in there and cleared out the post oak savanna, the trees, and planted it in like Bermuda grass or some kind of other improved pasture. But for the most part, the post oak savanna is pretty much left untouched as far as major altercations from us as humans. And again, the only major town's College Station, so we don't have a major urban area altering a lot of the landscape. Historically, it would have been post oak trees, and it would have had fire go through it about every 3 to 5 years. It would have left an open understory of little blue stem. You would have just had hardwoods in the major river bottoms around the Brazos River and Trinity in Colorado. But just like in the piney woods, we have a loss of that savanna habitat. So I know this isn't the best of picture, but it's a good example. The picture on the left is about what probably 98% of the post oak savanna looks like now. You still have the post oak trees, and a lot of them are very old, 100, 200 years plus, but without the fire, the yaupon has just completely choked out the understory. And compare that to the picture on the right, which is the Gus Engling Wildlife Management Area up in Anderson County. That they do fire there regularly and managed in this wildlife management area is a showcase to show you what the post oak savanna should look like. And it should go without saying, but which one of these pictures do y'all think's better for wildlife? I mean, they both look like forests, but the one on the right, you can see, has a lot more plant diversity, has a lot different types of habitat for the animals to use. So because of that, we've lost a lot of our grassland species in this part of the state, quail, turkey, stuff like that. We do have 2 protected species that can be found in this part of the state. The first is going to be the Houston toad. That's the guy on the left. And then it's named after our famous Sam Houston. But either way, the Houston toad lives in these acidic bogs that you can kind of find in the post oak savanna, and then some around Houston down into the coastal prairie also. But it's mainly just now found in the post oak savanna. and it's a protected species just because of loss of habitat. And then the picture in the middle is the Navasota lady's tresses, which is a endangered species of orchid that can be found in scattered populations around College Station, kind of over towards Huntsville, and then south towards Bastrop in the Austin area. Both of these species aren't necessarily endangered of going extinct, but they're found in very limited populations, and most of those populations are on private land. So that's why there's a conservation concern for them because of that need. I mean, I do know in college, outside of College Station, there on if y'all ever drive 30 between Huntsville and College Station, there's the dump there right before you get into Brazos County. I know there was a population of Navasota's lady's tresses found where they were going to put that landfill. So the landfill company had to do some mitigation work. So basically, there's a part of the dump that they can't touch where the Navasota lady's tress grows. So that's kind of a unique story there. And then the picture on the right, that's actually going to be if y'all ever been through Bastrop there, up 71, the Lost Pines. The Lost Pines you would find in the Post Oak Savanna. It's kind of unique. So the Lost Pines, I'll go back to here. The Lost Pines, if y'all can see, like I said, is found in Bastrop County, which is going to be pretty much right in the middle of this picture. Historically, when I mean like several thousand years ago when the climate was a little bit cooler, the piney woods extended all the way to Bastrop County. So you had the piney woods extending a lot further west in Texas. Well, in Bastrop County, there's still a remnant part of there's still a remnant stand of loblolly pines there. So it's called the Lost Pines in the state. But it's kind of, I don't know if you want to say funny or unique, but some maps won't separate the Lost Pines from the Post Oak Savanna. And other ecological region maps will basically include the Bastrop County as part of the piney woods, just a disjunct part of it. So kind of depends on your source there. All right, so that's it for the Post Oak Savanna. Y'all got any questions over that? If not, we'll move right along. Okay. So as we move further west, we're going to start getting out of the trees because we're getting less rainfall. And we move kind of into this black colored region. And I don't know if they intentionally did this on the map or just luck, but the region's called the Blackland Prairie. So it's the associated color on there. But the Blackland Prairie is a tall grass prairie. And this is our first true prairie ecoregion in the state as you move east to west. So it basically starts up just north. It starts north of Dallas. I will note that Fort Worth, which is in Tarrant County, and so that's the west of Dallas. Fort Worth is actually in a different ecoregion. That's our next ecoregion. So you don't really know it nowadays because DFW is such a big metroplex, but DFW is actually split by two different ecoregions. So Dallas is in the Blackland Prairie, and then it extends northeast to Dallas. And then it basically, once it gets to Dallas, it follows that I-35 corridor down through Waco, Austin, San Marcos, New Braunfels, and all the way through San Antonio. And once you get down there towards San Antonio, it's basically only about a 20 to 30 mile strip compared up around north of Dallas, where it's about a 150-mile strip of Blackland Prairie. I'll ask y'all, why, so Blackland Prairie follows I-35 corridor, and I just named off all these major towns in it. And this is important to know because we have all these major towns in the Blackland Prairie, and that's going to alter our landscape because of urbanization. But the Blackland Prairie, why it has all these major towns is because it has really good soil. So I'd ask y'all, why are all these major towns in an ecoregion that has really good soil? Well, the answer to that is that, in the 1800s, when we were building Texas out, and even in the early 1900s, where agriculture was our major economy in the state, which still is, but obviously back then it was the major economy. All these major towns popped up along in the Blackland Prairie because it was the best farmland in the state, and these towns sprouted up to take the crop to harvest. So, to ship it on railroad later on or whatnot. So Also, I want to point out, if y'all hadn't noticed already, so we have the northern Blackland Prairie, which is that strip we already talked about. But if y'all can look really closely, we actually have a disjunct, what we call the southern Blackland Prairie, or sometimes you'll hear it referred to as the Fayette Prairie. And that basically starts really close to y'all in Montgomery and Walker County. The far western parts of Montgomery actually are in the southern Blackland Prairie. And it's this little strip that extends down through Grimes and Navasota, and then through Brenham and Washington County, and all the way down to just north of Victoria in DeWitt County. And so if y'all ever driven through, like I said, Yoakum, Schulenburg on I-10 going west to San Antonio, or around Brenham or Navasota, you might have never thought of it, but it usually opens up quite a bit through there. And the reasoning for that is your soil changes and you get into a grassland ecosystem. So it's kind of a disjunct prairie within the post oak savanna. So, like I said, Blackland Prairie is our first true grass prairie. It has very deep soils, which makes for good farming. Even though you think of a grassland as just being this uniform, and I'll show y'all a picture here in a minute, just grass. It's actually what we call microtopography, and it's very common in the Blackland Prairie, where basically little dips in the ground where it holds more water, or little hills that are a little bit drier, basically cause a different assortment of grasses and wildflowers that grow on it. So even though it might look like a monoculture of grasses looking across the landscape, it really has all these different little habitats mixed in. Farming is dominated, and it still is a major farming ecoregion of the state. We've talked about the urbanization. So the Blackland Prairie has been greatly altered. And just like most of our true tall grass prairies in North America, 99.9% of it's gone. What you see driving down I-35 now is not what you saw 150, 200 years ago. It's home to what we call the Big Four, and the Big Four is the big four grasses that make up our tall grass prairie. So that's switchgrass, little blue stem, big blue stem, and Indian grass. Not much woody vegetation. The only place you would have found woody vegetation would have been along the deepest creeks and riverbeds. And unfortunately, because of all the urbanization and farming, most of the species have long disappeared from this part of the state. So picture on the left, that's a soil core of what the Blackland Prairie looks like. You can see black dirt, good farming dirt. Picture on the right, that's a remnant prairie tract up northeast of Dallas. So that's what the tall grass prairie should look like. And here's a picture of the Big Four. So I know grasses are terrible to ID by pictures, and all grasses pretty much look the same, but that's little blue stem on the top left. Bottom left is big blue stem, and the middle is Indian grass, and the far right is switchgrass. And unfortunately, like I talked about, most of our species aren't necessarily extinct in North America that used to be found in the Blackland Prairie of Texas, but they're no longer found in this part of Texas because they're expired. We basically, urbanization and farming, I mean, I kind of joke, but here's an artist representation of what the Blackland Prairie looked like in Texas. How many of y'all have ever driven down I-35 between Dallas and Austin or around Waco and have seen anything that looks remotely similar to what this would have looked like 200 years ago? I mean, I ain't seen no bison wandering down the side of I-35, or wolves, or fires going in the background. We got prairie dogs, hognose skunk here on the left. Those are found further west. You got prairie chicken. I know it's probably a little dilated since it's blown up, but you got prairie chickens are gone. So about probably 2/3 of these species in this picture are long gone from the Blackland Prairie in Texas. All right, so as we move further west, we get into kind of this yellow type color. This is what we're going to call the cross timbers of Texas. And the cross timbers is basically exactly what it sounds like. It's a mixture of prairie and woodlands. And so when the pioneers were first coming across Texas and going east to west, they realized that it was strips of grassland, and then strips of woodland. And the woodlands were made up of really just kind of scrubby oak trees, post oak and blackjack oak mostly, and some live oaks. So they named it cross timbers because it was prairie that was crossed by timbers. So that one's kind of an easy name to remember. But the cross timbers lies west of the Blackland Prairie. It starts up in the Red River. A large chunk of it actually extends into Oklahoma. Most of the central part of Oklahoma is actually in the cross timbers. But the part that extends down into Texas goes in that area between Fort Worth's included in it, Denton's included in it. It goes west, not quite all the way to Wichita Falls and Abilene. Those are in a different ecoregion, but just almost to Wichita Falls and Abilene. And then it extends south down through that, I don't know, there's not many big towns through there, but Granbury, Weatherford, and then just west of Waco and Temple area. And then depending on the map, some of them, as you can see with golds, they go all the way down to the northern part of Travis County, which would be Austin. But a lot of ecoregion maps will stop the cross timbers a little bit further north, more towards Coryell and the Waco area, McClellan County. So it's kind of and the reasoning for that is the cross timbers is kind of a transitional ecoregion in Texas. It's going from prairies, it's going from the timbers to the prairies, going east to west, and then when you go south, it transitions into that hill country or that central Texas part of the state. Because of it has a variety of soil types and geography, everything from pretty rugged hills to kind of just rolling plains. Is really our last, what you could call a forest ecoregion in the state. Everything further west of here is desert until you get out into, or is grasslands and desert until you get out to the mountains of West Texas. Rainfall begins to come limited in this part of the state. So up until this point, rainfall has not really been a factor in determining kind of, we have rainfall, we get droughts in this part of the state pretty commonly. So up until this point, drought isn't really a major concern for those regions of the state. Very ranching dominant. So a lot of the cross timbers looks like what it looked like before man came along. Not many major cities and hadn't been altered much by farming. So open prairies, and we have these oak forests, and then we also have what we call these oak mott juniper woodlands. And the best way to describe that's going to be kind of like what you see when you go to the hill country or central part of the state. And I refer to the hill country a lot because I know a lot of people have been there because it's popular to travel to, but it's kind of them juniper type woodlands. So here's some pictures of the cross timbers. The one on the left would have been around Weatherford, Texas, in a typical cross timbers landscape. You have a little blue stem prairie in the foreground, and then you have timbers crossing it, which that looks like live oaks and post oaks in the background. So I mentioned kind of wide topography. If y'all have ever heard of the Palo Pinto Mountains or Possum Kingdom Lake, that's going to fall into the cross timbers. And that's kind of a unique geological area you find here. And that's a picture of the Palo Pinto Mountains on the right. So it's kind of a really limestone, hilly, rugged area you find in this part of the state. And that's around Possum Kingdom Lake. There's not a whole lot of good wildlife to show here. And I don't say that in a bad way, but there's just not really any endangered species or any kind of unique species they call the cross timbers home. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with, I love turkey, I love white-tailed deer, I love jackrabbits, but the cross timbers, I say, just has your typical wildlife you find in Texas. And that there's really no unique species to talk about. I will ask y'all, I took the picture of the turkey myself while I was turkey hunting one time. And I don't know if y'all can tell, but I always ask people when I show this picture, if you look at its head, does it look kind of odd to y'all? I always thought that hen looked like she was missing an eye. And I don't know if it's just the way the camera came across, but it just looks like she was missing her left eye. So that's why I throw that picture in there. Just something kind of unique. Wildlife finds a way to survive. So as we move further west from the cross timbers, we're now getting into what we call the rolling plains of Texas. So that's going to be kind of that pinkish salmon type color, I guess you would call it. Fairly big ecoregion. Golds does not divide it up into two ecoregions. A lot of sources will, and I kind of agree that it needs to be divided up into two. But basically, if you can divide this salmon color up into two, if you drew a line basically halfway down the middle of it, the eastern part of it is a lot more rolling plains, and the western part of it is a lot more rugged canyon country. And I'm going to talk about that here in a minute and show y'all pictures. But basically, the rolling plains is going to, the eastern edge of it is going to be Wichita County, which is going to be Wichita Falls. And then I think Abilene's down here in Taylor County. So Abilene and Wichita Falls are on the east, and then it goes west across that northern third of Texas to about the middle of the Panhandle, and then up into the Panhandle. And then any of y'all know what is, you kind of see this kind of has the western side of it's really rugged, and it kind of has like little arms that stick in. So that's what we call the Cat Rock Escarpment. And I'm going to show you a lot of pictures of that here in a minute, because that's probably one of the more fascinating parts of the state, and a lot of popular tourist areas up there. But it's a very rugged canyon land. So we have the Cat Rock Escarpment that separates the rolling plains from the high plains, basically south of the Panhandle, from about Armstrong County, which is Amarillo, down to east of Lubbock, down to Midland. That's your Cat Rock Escarpment. It's a very predominant dividing line. I'm going to show pictures of that here in a minute. And then up in the Panhandle, so way up in the Panhandle of Texas, y'all see how the salmon color kind of splits the Panhandle in half? That's going to be the Canadian River going across the Panhandle, and we call that the Canadian Escarpment. So the ecoregion we're going to talk about next is the high plains, but that's kind of more of that orange color. That's very flat and level compared to the salmon color, which is going to be the Cat Rock Escarpment, and the Canadian breaks up in the northern part of the state. It's a very dividing line. So that's why I say the rolling plains, I think they really should be divided into two, because the eastern half of it is more just rolling plains, like it says in the ecoregion name, while the western half is more of a canyon land country, and some people will call that the Cat Rock and Canadian Break ecoregion of Texas, or the Southwest Tablelands. But for gold's sakes, for today's lesson, we're going to just call it all the rolling plains. Hope that all made sense. I know I'm throwing a lot of information at y'all. But the rolling plains are basically a southern extension of what we call the low interior plains. So this is the same plains that the settlers went across when you think of, the guys going across and the gals going across and the wagons going across the Great Plains of North America. The rolling plains is the far southern extension of the Great Plains of North America. There is not a whole lot of difference between the rolling plains in Texas and the mid parts of Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, on up into the Dakotas, other than temperature, and we get a lot more brush down here. But a lot of our plants and animal life is the same. A lot of red clay and sand. Drawing a blank here. Oh, if y'all ever like the Brazos River, or like down around Houston and stuff, a lot of times it'll have kind of a red color to it. That's because it's all this red dirt flowing down from the rolling plains in this part of the state, because this is where the Brazos River starts. A lot of our major rivers start in this part of the state. Farming and ranching is dominant. This is where we get into that mid-grass prairie. So our grasses are topping out at 12 to 24 inches. Woody vegetation historically would have been limited to just the major river bottoms along the Brazos River and the Colorado River and the Red River. But over time, due to lack of fire, overgrazing, and us as man altering the landscape, we have allowed it to transform into a shrubland. And this shrubland has basically caused a near loss to all of our endemic prairie species. Ironically, bobwhite quail, which is a species of concern for a lot of people due to their populations declining across their range, really thrive in a shrubland where you have some thick shrubs surrounded by some open grassland. So bobwhite quail have thrived in the rolling plains, how we have created it. And it's really the epicenter for bobwhite quail now in Texas. It's really one of the last strongholds really in North America for bobwhite quail. So the picture on the left is what the rolling plains looks like south of Wichita Falls. Now, I know that looks like a grassland with rolling plains, but I can guarantee you, because I took this picture, 95% of those grasses out there aren't native. That's not the grasses that it would have looked like. They've all been replaced, but still gives you a representation of what the rolling plains looks like in Texas. The picture on the right, top right, is going to be a Lake Arrowhead State Park by Wichita Falls. And I put that in here because you can see how you have a grassland in the foreground, but you'll see how thick the brush is in the background. The mesquite, and that's all mesquite. Mesquite has absolutely overrun this part of the state. I mean, it's like 75 to 80% of it has just been overrun by mesquite, and it's gotten so thick, it's basically a forest. The bottom right, that's going to be the Salt Fork of the Brazos River. And so a lot of our rivers major rivers in Texas, like I said, get their starts up here, and as they start getting really shallow, and they get really salty too. That's why it's called the Salt Fork of the Brazos River. Rainfall starts to get limited, so we don't get good flows in our river. So that's going to be what I've talked about so far. Is going back, it's going to be that eastern half of the rolling plains, basically east of the Panhandle and around Abilene and Wichita Falls. When we get to the western part of it, which, like I said, some people will call that the Southwest Tablelands or the Caprock Escarpment and Canadian Breaks, this is a very rugged landscape. And I already kind of mentioned how it has that latitudinal divide between the high plains, where if y'all have ever drove east of Lubbock, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's flat as a pancake up there, and all of a sudden the earth just drops out by about 500 to 1,000 feet. I mean, it's a drop. And very arid, not a lot of farming because it's all rocky, dominated by grama and buffalo grass. And side oats grama is actually our state grass, Texas. Just a little side note. You have a lot of juniper and shrub oak that kind of thrives here because of the rocky landscape. And we're going to talk about the Caprock and the Canadian River here in a minute. So all right. To see which pictures I had coming up. So here's going to be pictures of the western side of the rolling plains, and this is all pictures of the Caprock Escarpment. And as y'all can see, it's very, very rugged, and this is one of my favorite ecoregions in the state, and I think it's probably a lot of people like to go up there. So top left, anybody recognize what that picture is? That's Paladora Canyon State Park, which is the second largest canyon in the country. So we kind of nickname it up there our own mini Grand Canyon. And that, I think they call that Lighthouse Rock, I believe, but it's a very popular park to go visit. The picture on the right is going to be Caprock Canyon State Park. And I took that while I was out there actually hunting one time. We were all dad hunting out there. On a draw hunt to manage. All dad are basically a non-native species, so trying to manage them like hogs, just getting them off the landscape. But you can see it's a very red rock, very rugged landscape.
Yeah, and, you can't. I mean, I've been in there at times of the year that it feels like you're almost in the Grand Canyon in some ways. I mean, yep. It's really weird.
It's a very unique ecoregion, to say the least. So the picture on the left, I'm going to kind of jump around here, but the picture on the bottom left, that's also a Caprock Canyon State Park. And I showed this picture in here because y'all look at that picture. I mean, you can tell it's kind of rugged hills, kind of a canyon country, but it looks like you could kind of walk across that. I mean, it doesn't look like it'd be too difficult to walk across. Well, I took that picture right before we wanted to walk across it because we were hiking out there, and we wanted to get to that ridge kind of in the background there, and we thought we could make it across. Well, it took us about 15 minutes to realize about every couple hundred yards through there was about a 200-foot drop off. It was just little canyons inside the canyons. I mean, there was no way you were going to get across there without hurting yourself or dying. I mean, it was pretty rugged. So we had to backtrack and find another way. But just you can't overestimate how rugged this country is. Um, Little side note, Paladora Canyon was actually one of the major last strongholds for Native Americans in North America, in the US, because it was so rugged the army couldn't get down there to fight them. But so now I want to jump to this picture in the middle, and you can see it's a waterway. That's the Canadian River, which it's a very shallow river with a bunch of sandbars, and I'm going to talk about that more here in a minute. But that really, for us here in a precipitation area in East Texas, that doesn't look like a major water source. Well, up there in the Panhandle, that is their major water source. That is their only major water source, surface water-wise, and the only other water source they have is pumping water out of the ground. So the Canadian River is a unique both for humans and wildlife. So here's just some pictures of wildlife you start finding in this part of the state. And we'll just go we'll stop top left and go clockwise. So we have a burrowing owl, which lives in prairie dog towns, and they're kind of a cool animal. Then top right's going to be side oats grama. Like I said, that's our state grass. Bottom right's bobwhite quail. We talked about them already. Bottom left, everybody knows that's our prairie dogs. Rolling plains is where you can start finding prairie dogs in the state. And then a lot of our state lizard, which used to be pretty common throughout the state, or Texas horned lizard or horned toad. This is where it's really common in this part of the state still. So here's some more unique animals. So we're going to talk about, where do we want to start here? Well, I'll just bottom left, that's black grama. So you can see our grasses here start to get pretty small. But I want to talk about the bird in the top left and then the little fish in the bottom right. So both of you would think these two animals aren't connected at all. Well, they really are. They're both protected species that depend on the Canadian River in Texas for their survival, especially the little minnow on the bottom right. So the one on the top left, that's going to be an inland tern. And that thing, inland least tern, and basically these terns, they nest on little sandbars in these rivers, and including the Canadian River and then some other rivers in Oklahoma and Kansas and Nebraska, kind of up through the plains country, where they're really shallow, but they're really shallow and spread out wide. So they create all these sandbars for these birds to nest on. And if you'd believe me or not, that's actually a picture of the tern sitting on its nest. It does nothing to make an actual nest. It just finds gravel on a sandbar and plops down and makes eggs. Well, or lays eggs and raises its young out. Well, that's all good. And the reason why they want these sandbars is these wide, shallow rivers like the Canadian River, these sandbars are disconnected from the shoreline. So the water basically creates a barrier from predators like coyotes and raccoons. Well, what has happened over time is either we dam these rivers or we've restricted the flow to where these sandbars are now connected to the shoreline. So a lot of the nesting habitat for inland terns are no longer, the birds, their nests just get predated by coyotes and raccoons and other predators, skunks. So that's why they're in decline, but they still have nesting colonies on the Canadian River in the rolling plains of Texas. The little fish on the right, bottom right, that's the Arkansas silvery minnow. And this guy depends on the Canadian River. Even though it's called the Arkansas River silvery minnow, it pretty much depends on the Canadian River now. It used to be found throughout the Arkansas River watershed. But what this little guy does is it lays its eggs in the water column. And if the egg, don't quote me on the exact hours and time, but if the egg falls out of the water column and hits the bottom, the egg dies. It has to stay suspended in the water column. And I think it takes a day or 2 days for that egg to hatch. So that whole time it has to be moving down the river and it can't hit the bottom substrate or it dies. So basically what happened in the Arkansas watershed, which the Canadian River is part of, we've dammed so much of it that it's either turned into lakes or we restricted the flow on a lot of it through us taking water out of the river for human purposes. to where the water now moves so slow that the eggs die before they hatch because they're hitting the bottom because there's not enough water moving through the river. Well, parts of the Canadian River in Texas is some of the only parts of in the Arkansas River watershed where this minnow can still survive because there's enough moving water to so the egg hatches. So this little minnow, which looks pretty, just as like any other minnow, needs the Canadian River in Texas for its continuous survival. So enough on the Canadian River. The picture in the middle, most of y'all probably know that's a bison. It's not a buffalo. I always have to double check myself. You'll probably heard me kind of stutter there for a minute. We have buffalo in Africa and Asia. In Texas, we have bison. And so that's actually a picture of the bison at Caprock Canyon State Park. I kind of call it our little Yellowstone now. I don't know if many other people do, but I do for this presentation. It's probably been about 10 years or so now, but they released bison into Caprock Canyon State Park, and they're free roaming. So, I mean, they're kind of contained in the park by fence, but I mean, it's not really a fence they can't destroy if they wanted to. And in the parks, I don't know how big the park is, 20, 30,000 acres or something. So, I mean, they're basically free roaming. And so that's pretty cool that that's really our only free roaming herd in Texas. On a side note, so our bison in Texas that were historically here, and including what the bison that were released in Caprock Canyon State Park, that's actually what we call southern bison, which is the same species that was found throughout North America. But the northern bison was a little bit bigger and it was more adapted to cold weather compared to the southern bison found in like Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, southern parts of Colorado. It was smaller and more adapted to hotter, warmer climates. And basically, over time, well, not over time, we all know what happened to the bison. We hunted them to extinction almost. Well, Goodnight Ranch, which most of y'all might have heard of Goodnight, he was a famous Texas cattle owner, and the Goodnight Trail was actually named after him. That was one of the historical cattle trails that went up through the plains. Goodnight Ranch, his wife, which the ranch was up in this part of the Texas, his wife realized one time that all the bison were disappearing, and if they didn't do anything, they were all going to just disappear from the landscape totally. So she herself in the 1800s went out on their ranch, and she, I guess, rounded up, I don't know what it was, 20, 30 bison that were left on their ranch, and they basically put them in a pen and they kind of domesticated them. Well, after so many years, that they donated that herd to Texas, to the state of Texas, and that became Texas' official bison herd. Texas's official bison herd. And some of those individuals were eventually released in Caprock Canyon State Park. Well, the unique part of that is, if it wasn't for the Goodnight Ranch, all the southern bison would have went extinct. We wouldn't have southern bison anymore, which is a unique subspecies. So our whole herd in Texas, our whole official herd in Texas was basically rescued, was down to about 20 or 30 individuals that the Goodnights saved off their ranch. It's kind of a unique story there. So top right is going to be mule deer. So the rolling plains is the first part of the state where you start seeing mule deer pretty common. And if I was in person, I'd make y'all guess, but I'm not going to make y'all guess online. Why do we think we're called mule deer? Well, if you look at the picture, they got big ears, right? So when the settlers were first coming along, they realized that the mule deer had big ears, kind of like their mules. So that's why they called them mule deers. Well, they got big ears not because they want to look like mules. They're actually serving a function. So they live in these more arid, hotter climates. So the big ears actually allow for more airflow or more blood flow because they got more blood vessels up there, more surface area. And the big ears are basically used as a cooling method, got more blood flowing through the ears, so it helps them cool down. So that's mule deer. So as we move further west, we get out of that salmon color, which is the rolling plains, and we get kind of into the orange color. This is going to be our high plains of Texas. You also hear people call it the Llano Estacado, which is Spanish for stack plain. And that's a pretty good description of it. It's flat as a pancake. They say you can see brake lights for 100 miles. And if you stand on a tuna can, you can see brake lights for 200 miles. There's several jokes like that from up there. But either way, it's basically that northern part of the panhandle, and then kind of starts in Amarillo's on the edge of it, and then that kind of goes down through Lubbock and down to Midland and Odessa, and Midland and Ector County, and then extends into New Mexico. So the high plains is our short grass prairie. Historically, it was only 4 to 6 inches tall, very arid, very flat plain, a lot of soil erosion. A lot of wind in this part of the state. A lot of wind, like 50-mile-per-hour wind. Days with sustained winds at 50 miles per hour is not uncommon. So because of that, we get a lot of soil erosion. This is where the Dust Bowl happened, and that's one reason why, because of the wind and then bad farming practices. Ironically, even though it's so arid and so dry, it has a huge aquifer underneath it called the Ecological aquifer. Along with that, and actually pretty good dirt soil, it's great farming country. So farming dominates this part of the state. And there is some dry land farming, but almost it's all dependent on the Ecological aquifer, and I always have a hard time pronouncing that word. Oil and gas is pretty big in this part of the state also, which leads to some conservation issues. I'm going to talk about Playa Lakes here in a minute, but we do have what I would call some remnant prairie tracts with some of those Great Plains, the iconic Great Plains species. And the reasoning for that is most of the high plains looks a lot like this picture on the left, bottom left. Like we said, flat stack plain where you can see forever. Most of that has been converted into farmland. But there is some corners of the high plains that look a lot like that picture on the top right, where we have these, what we call sand hills or sand sheets. Well, you can imagine hilly sand hills don't make good farming. So a lot of that landscape was left as ranch land. And so we have a lot of what are endemic Great Plains species still found in some of these sand plains. But most of it has been converted over to farmland. There's also a lot of oil and gas, and I'll talk about that in here in a minute as far as conservation issues. But the bottom right, I throw in here a picture. That's a picture of the biggest blizzard ever in Texas, I believe, or the record snowfall in Texas. Don't ask me how much it was, because I don't remember, but you can see it's up almost to the top of his windows. So I put that in here because the high plains is that region of the state that is very temperate in climate, and it can get 110 degrees in the summer and it can get negative 20 in the winter. So if you want to live up there, you got to be pretty tough, because between the wind and the dust storms and the blizzard, it's rough country. But the top left is what a lot of it looks like now. It's farmland. But as y'all see in the middle, you have all these wet spots. And what those aren't man-made ponds. It's not lakes. That's what we call playa lakes. And these basically are shallow depressions in this flat landscape that holds water when it rains. Now, a lot of times they're dry, but when it does rain, they hold water. And so because of that reason, they can't be farmed, because obviously you can't be farming cotton or wheat or whatnot in standing water. So it's a wetland basically. And the panhandle and the high plains are full of these playa lakes, which makes it one of the major wintering areas for waterfowl in the central part of North America. We have a lot of geese, a lot of ducks, and about 3/4 to 1 million sandhill cranes migrate down to live on these playa lakes in the high plains. And top left's a picture of sandhill cranes, one of my most favorite animals on a side note. I think they're absolutely awesome. And you can also, we do get a few sandhill cranes south of Houston. So if y'all ever want to go see cranes, go down to Galveston or down around Freeport or Missouri area. But either way, so you get cranes, waterfowl, geese. a few pockets of bison on some preserves. Bottom left is going to be our prairie chicken. That's actually going to be um, our short tail prairie chicken. Yeah, drew a blank there. This guy has been proposed for protection status under the Endangered Species Act, but due to oil and gas and landowner concerns, it's kind of been postponed for a while. So basically what's going on is you used to be able to hunt these up in Panhandle, but you haven't been able to do that for a while. They were a pretty common game bird species, but because we've lost so much of the grassland, they've pretty much been restricted to just these areas where we have these sand hills, like in the top right, because there wasn't farming there. Well, these sand hills in this part of the state is also where you find a lot of oil and gas reserves. So hence the conflict between oil and gas reserves and prairie chickens. So it was proposed to put the prairie chickens, the short-tailed prairie chickens, on the Endangered Species Act. Well, the landowners and ranchers and people in the oil and gas industry didn't want this for obvious, with protections that go along with that and interfering with their businesses. So they all got together along with other landowners and people in Oklahoma and Kansas and Colorado and New Mexico that have short-tailed prairie chickens. And basically they came up with this conservation plan, which said, we're going to be proactive, and we're going to take efforts as private landowners and private business owners to try to keep this bird species off of the Endangered Species Act, because we don't want the regulations that come along with that. So we're going to try to do the right thing and protect this species, because in the long run, it's going to benefit us. That's still a work in progress. They're still trying to figure that one out. But bottom right is pronghorn antelope, another one of my cool species. You can find them, used to be found as far east in Texas as the Blackland Prairie and even down towards the Keene Ranch in South Texas. Now you can only find them up in the high plains and in parts of West Central and West Texas. But very neat species. They are the fastest land mammal in North America. I think they can top out at like 50, 60 miles an hour. They can move. And you would think they could also jump over a fence, but they evolved with no fences because, again, they evolved on this landscape that was flat and treeless. They had no need to jump. They just ran from their predators. So a pronghorn isn't like a deer. It will not jump over a fence. It'll hit a barbed wire fence and go the other direction. They do. And biologists believe there might be two reasons. One, they either mentally just do not know they have the capability to jump because they didn't evolve with the need to jump, or two, they might just not have, because they didn't jump through evolution. They never developed the muscles in their shoulders to sustain them from hitting the ground. So, but either way, it's kind of, you would think something that can move 50 miles an hour and then looks like a deer could jump, but it can't. All right, so as we move, we were going east to west, kind of over, I guess you could say, the northern 2/3 of Texas. We're now going to kind of jump south, but we're still going east to west for this next region. So we get to our driest ecoregion. This is going to be what some people call the Trans-Pecos, the Chihuahua Desert, but it's basically our desert in Texas. And it's that western part that sticks out. And so it's west of Midland, Odessa, but it does include the Permian Basin and then a lot of our major mountain ranges in Big Bend. It kind of blends into that central hill country part of the state, which is going to be the next ecoregion we're going to talk about in the blue. Depending on who's drawing the map, some people will draw it like here. Other people will take it as far east as like Del Rio and even further east than that. So it just depends. But the Trans-Pecos is one of four major deserts in North America. So we have four major deserts in North America. We have the Trans-Pecos, or what some people will call the Chihuahua. So Chihuahua or Trans-Pecos. Then we have the Mojave, the Great Basin, and then the Sonora Desert. misspoke there. So each one of these four major deserts, the Chihuahua, the Great Basin, the Mojave, and the Sonora Desert, are all characteristic by one unique plant pretty much. So the Great Basin is like up around Utah in that area. They have the sagebrush or the sagebrush country. The Sonora Desert has the Sonora type cactus. We all, I think of Arizona, the cactus, what Arizona looks like. The Mojave is going to be that area, the Death Valley there in California and Nevada, or in Nevada, excuse me. And that's basically marked by no plant life because it doesn't rain there at all. But we're lucky enough in Texas, we have the Trans-Pecos or the Chihuahua Desert, which is known for its creosote bush, which is just a nasty, nasty plant. And I'm going to show pictures of that and talk about it here in a minute. But this is our most unique geological region in Texas. It has everything from limestone reefs to volcanic rocks, has a lot of ancient volcanoes, a lot of erosion. It really runs the gamut. It's what we call basin and range geography. So it's mountains with flat deserts in between. As well, we have a lot of internally drained areas. So basically we have salt flats. We have areas where it rains. It forms these lakes when it rains, and then the water evaporates and it leaves a salt flat. Limited farming, except along the Rio Grande where they have irrigation. A lot of rangeland, oil and gas is big. But out here is where we have a lot of unique species that you find nowhere else in the state. We have a lot of species that reach their northern limits up from Mexico, and we have also a lot of species that reach their southern limit down from the Rocky Mountains of New Mexico and Colorado. So we call the mountain ranges out here sky islands because basically the elevation gets high enough that it creates cooler temperatures and more rainfall, and it creates different plants and animal life and basically creates an island in the desert. And then we have a variety of springs and a variety of vegetation. So here's kind of, these pictures, we'll start in the top left. And basically we're going from the bottom of the desert floor up several thousand feet to the top of the mountains. So on the bottom of the desert, we have our creosote bush, which I mentioned is kind of what is the trademark of the Chihuahua Desert or the Trans-Pecos, just, flat desert, typical what we think of desert. And then we go to the picture on the top right where we get a little higher in elevation, go about 1,000 feet or so. And you get a little bit more rainfall and you start to have these high plain grasslands, especially around like Marfa and Alpine. Then you go to the bottom left and you get a little bit higher up in the mountains, and that's kind of an aerial view, but you start to get, if you zoomed in on that, you'd have some brush and some more woody type vegetation. And then you get to the picture in the bottom middle, which that's going to be Mount Livermore in the Davis Mountains. That's the picture of the second highest peak in Texas, where you actually see we have pine forest, and that's actually ponderosa and pinon pines, which are very common pine tree you find out in the higher elevations of New Mexico and Colorado and Arizona. And so you basically go from flat desert with very limited vegetation to grasslands to shrublands to pine forest or mountain forest. And then the picture on the bottom right, that's actually a picture of the salt flat next to the Guadalupe Mountains. So I want to hit a few other points on these pictures. I talked about top left, that's creosote bush. You can see the creosote bush is just dominating that landscape. Creosote bush is a nasty plant because it secretes creosote, like its name says. And basically that compound limits other plants from growing in the soil around it. So before we came along and overgrazed the desert, it used to be a lot more grassland in the lower elevations. Well, nature's going to replace something that the cow's not going to eat, so it replaced it with creosote bush, which was always out there, but it was never as common. And now we just have these flats of creosote bush that's secreting these chemical compounds. It's not letting any other plants grow, so it's just we're stuck with creosote bush. And I don't know, I'm sure there's some animal out there that eats it, but it's not known for it's not known for being very beneficial for wildlife. And then bottom left, if there's any geologists in the room, y'all probably recognize what that looks like. But that's the reason why you kind of have that layered effect in the mountains out here. That's actually ancient lava flows that have cooled and they've created these mountains and kind of that layered effect. So here's some pictures of what it looks like up in some of the Sky Island Mountains out in West Texas. The last picture is a picture of a ponderosa pine. You can see very tall pine trees. You know, they're as tall as any pine tree we can get out here in East Texas, and we're out in a desert landscape. Middle picture is a picture of an alligator juniper. And y'all can probably guess why it's called an alligator juniper. If you look at its bark, it looks like the back of an alligator. And the picture on the right is a Texas madrone tree, which I think is one of our most beautiful trees in Texas. You can find them in other parts of the state, but they seem to grow the biggest and the tallest in the Trans-Pecos Mountains out in West Texas. And so this Texas madrone tree, its bark kind of just sloughs or falls off. And it's lapped with, it's kind of hard in this picture to tell, but it's lapped with almost this white salmon color looking bark. And so it's really pretty. It has really its foliage is really dark green. And then you can see kind of some of the branches on the top that have died. When the branches died, I guess because it's so arid out there, they don't really rot. They just kind of turn black and stay on the tree. So you kind of have this mixture of really dark green foliage with this white bark with like salmon inlay color, and then this real black dark looking dead wood. So really pretty looking tree. So here's a whole variety of animals and plants and wildlife and fish and birds and whatnot that you can find out in the Trans-Pecos that you can't really find anywhere else in Texas. Well, you can find the pronghorn antelope, like we said, up in the high plains, but you can also find them out here in the high desert grasslands around Marfa and Alpine. The top middle picture is a canyon towhee. Nothing special about that bird other than that's a very common bird out in the western United States. It reaches its far eastern limit in West Texas. The top right picture is a picture of a pupfish. So we have several species of darters and pupfish that are found in these desert springs. So one of the most famous ones is going to be Balmorhea. So Balmorhea has a very famous spring out there. So we have several of these desert springs that have these pupfish and darters that are found nowhere else in the world. So one of them, I can't quote any off the top of my head, but let's say like one of them is, we'll say the Balmorhea pupfish. It's found only in that one spring out in West Texas. So they're protected species because they're only found in literally one hole, and the spring might be the size of some of y'all's dining rooms. I mean, they're not very big water holes, and they're home to one fish species that's found nowhere else in the world. Bottom left is our bighorn sheep. So Parks and Wildlife has worked to restore bighorn sheep to some of the mountains out in West Texas. They were originally lost from West Texas because they originally became extinct in West Texas due not only to overhunting, but also to grazing by sheep, which caused habitat loss and also brought diseases that the bighorn sheep couldn't compete with. But Parks and Wildlife has done a good job at restocking them, and they're now spreading out in West Texas to several different mountain ranges. We've had the black bear come back into the Big Bend. I'm sure some of y'all probably have heard that story. It's been so successful out in the West Texas, it started to spread to more places, and we're starting to see black bears returning to parts of Central and South Texas. And so pretty good news there. I mean, bears tend to be making a recovery across the state. But anyway, the black bear story in the Big Bend out in West Texas is unique in natural heritage because it is one of the only known examples in modern times where a large mammal has repopulated an area on its own. So we did not bring black bears back to the Big Bend. They repopulated them on their own from several hundred miles to the south of Mexico from populations in the mountains in northern Mexico. There is no other example in modern times where an animal repopulated an area on its own without the use of man manually repopulating it back to that region. So that's kind of unique there. And then the picture on the bottom right is a picture of a mountain jay. eating a cracker that I threw out to it. So just little birds like to eat food. All right, so here's some pictures of these are all pictures from within the Guadalupe Mountains, and we talked about them a little earlier. So the Guadalupe Mountains is our highest ecoregion in the state, or highest mountain range in the state. And some people will divide this into a separate ecoregion. Golds does not, but a lot of people that do ecoregion maps do. And the reasoning for that is it has a lot associated with the Rocky Mountains, both in the way it was created and a lot of its plant and animal life. So I'll just start in the middle. I know it's hard to tell, but that's a Douglas fir in the middle picture. So that is the same thing that you buy to put in your house for Christmas time that's growing wild in the Guadalupe Mountains. And that tree, I would say, was probably 60, 70 feet tall. That was a very big Douglas fir. Bottom left's a picture of a chipmunk. So we have one native chipmunk species in Texas, and the only place you can find it is in the Guadalupe Mountains. The picture on the bottom right is McKittrick Canyon, and that is probably I would say one of the most beautiful places to hike in Texas. And you can see the maple trees are turning color there in the fall. If I put that picture up there and told y'all that that was Texas, most of y'all would probably be saying I'm full of BS, because that does not look like Texas. It looks more like Colorado or Montana or something like that. Picture on the top right's elk. So we do have some elk out in West Texas. Guadalupe Mountains does have some free ranging elk. It's kind of a hot button topic out there. So we lost our native subspecies of elk. We overhunted them and due to loss of habitat. But ranchers brought back elk to Texas, but it was more the Rocky Mountain subspecies, not the desert subspecies. So Parks and Wildlife treats the elk out in West Texas as an exotic. So basically they don't manage them. They leave it up to the landowners to manage them. But for all intensive purposes, they're really a native species. And depending who you're asking, it can kind of be a hot button item if the state should be managing them as a native species or if they should be left as an exotic because they're not our true native species. So that's just a little side note there. And then the picture on the top left, that isn't a picture of a trout caught out of the Guadalupe Mountains, but that's a picture of a Rio Grande cutthroat trout caught in New Mexico. So we currently don't have any Rio Grande cutthroat trout in Texas, but we believe they were historically found in Texas in the high mountain streams in the Davis Mountains, probably for sure in the Guadalupe Mountains, and then maybe in some of the mountains down in Big Bend. Now, there's a lot of, I guess you could say, controversial conservation over this too, just like the elk, because our only example of Rio Grande cutthroat trout, which would be our only native trout species in Texas, we don't have a specimen. We have a conservationist or naturalist in the mid 1800s that was traveling across West Texas, and he stopped in the Davis Mountains and sketched a trout he saw swimming in a stream, and it looks like a Rio Grande cutthroat trout. He did not collect as an example of it, and there has never been, and since that time there was never any samples collected. We believe they went extinct because of stream flow loss, but a lot of that riparian habitat has been restored, and some people want to restock cutthroat trout from New Mexico back to some of these high mountain streams in West Texas. But we're really not 100% sure if they're native because we have one sketch from a naturalist in the 1800s, and do we really know if he was in Texas or was he in New Mexico? We believe he was in Texas, but we're not 100% sure. So there has been some talk about restocking them specifically in the Guadalupe Mountains and McKittrick Canyon, because we know trout can live there, because before it was a national park, the previous ranch owner stocked rainbow trout in McKittrick Canyon, and they're living there till to this day. Well, if you're going to restock our native trout, we know they're going to compete with the rainbow trout already there. So you would have to remove them And if I have any trout fishermen listening, I do apologize. Nothing against trout fishermen, but trout fishermen can be they can be pretty adamant in their ways, and they usually don't like people removing trout from a stream, especially one they've been at for, I guess at this point, going on 100 years, even though they're not a non-native species. So there's a lot of controversy with Rio Grande cutthroat trout in West Texas. Should we restock them? And if we do we remove the rainbow trout that are there that have basically become endemic because they've been there for over 100 years, even though they're not native and kind of part of our natural heritage out there? I will note the rainbow trout that you can find in the Guadalupe Mountains, they're about that big. They're not a big trout because it's not good habitat for them, and they top out at about 4 to 6 inches. I mean, they don't do good out there, but they survive. All right, so we got 3 more ecoregions to hit through, and I'll make sure to get y'all out of here before 9 because I'm sure y'all are getting tired like I am. But so we're in the blue, obviously. Now, this is going to be that central part of the state. This is the hill country, which is what most Texans call it, but its official name is going to be the Edwards Plateau. Typically, most people think of the Edwards Plateau or the hill country as kind of that area just west of Austin and San Antonio, and then around Uvalde, Garner State Park, Guadalupe River, Kerrville Junction, that area. But really, it extends all the way west to the Pecos River, almost to Fort Stockton, and then all the way north, just south to Midland and Odessa and San Angelo. San Angelo is actually in the Edwards Plateau, but most people just associate it with that area kind of around Austin and San Antonio because that's where it's the most rugged. So it's a limestone plateau. Limestone's erodes very easily, so it's created this dissected plateau that's hilly now. Very shallow soils, so never was a major farming area. Ranching has always been dominated. Urbanization has really taken its toll, especially on that eastern edge of the Edwards Plateau, as Austin and San Antonio and San Marcos has moved out. I mean, and a lot of people want to move to this part of the state. It's one of the more scenic areas. Historically, it would have been more of a savanna, but we now have caused a lot of that due to lack of fire. It's turned more into that thick juniper woodlands or cedar woodlands, as we like to call it. If you actually talk to some of the old ranches around there, and you read some of the old historical records, some of the original ranchers that settled in this part of the state in the 18 and early 1900s were German, and they came from that German Alps, Swiss Alps, Austria area. And they write that they settled here because it reminded them of the Austria Alps, or the areas around Switzerland and southern Germany, where it was this very hilly, rugged landscape. But if you picture the Alps, it doesn't have a lot of brush and cedar. It's more of a grassland type area. So they settled here because it reminded them of that. So it was a lot more of an open oak forest now compared to the woodlands that it is now. So it has a lot of important riparian areas because of what we call the karst geography. So karst geography is basically in limestone, where limestone that lets the water soak into an underground aquifer, which we call the Edwards Aquifer. And then it comes back through springs and makes our famous Comal Springs, Guadalupe River, Blanco River, Pedernales, stuff like that. And because of that, we have a lot of unique Texas endemics that are found nowhere else in the country or nowhere else in the world outside of Central Texas. So here's some pictures of the Edwards Plateau. Top left's a typical picture of a Edwards Plateau. Rugged limestone hills covered with oak and cedar or juniper. Top right's a sinkhole, which represents that karst geography. So we have a lot of sinkholes and caves and underground wells and springs in this part of the state. And like I said, they come up in these roaring springs, which makes these roaring, fast, clear moving rivers like the Guadalupe in the bottom right. So we have these very fragile and unique riparian ecosystems. Bottom left's going to be the picture of a Enchanted Rock. So that's actually a giant granite dome. So when you're looking at some ecoregions, they will actually draw another ecoregion in the state, even though not like we have enough as it is. Some people even divide the Edwards Plateau even out to even more. And that's basically going to be around that Llano and Mason County area, because it's what we call the Llano uplift, which is basically this big mound of granite. So remember, the Edwards Plateau is all limestone except for this like 2-county area, which is granite. So a lot of people will call that a different ecoregion. Plant and animal wise, there's not much difference, but because it's granite rock instead of limestone, they call it something different. And the Llano uplift, which is this area of these granite mounds like Enchanted Rock, is actually the oldest rocks in the state. So if you want to go stand on the oldest rocks in the state, go to Enchanted Rock. So like I said, we have a lot of unique wildlife in this part of the state. Bottom left picture is a picture of pinyon pine. So we have some of these western species kind of reach their eastern limits in this part of the state. But we also have a lot of Texas endemics. So the bottom central picture, that's going to be a fishhook cactus, and that's only found in a couple populations in the Edwards Plateau. The right picture is going to be a Guadalupe bass, which is our state bass, which is only found in some of these riparian clear-fed spring rivers in the central part of the state, found nowhere else in the world. And the top left is the golden cheek wobbler, which does winter down in Mexico, but it only summers in the Edwards Plateau of Texas, and then gets up into a little bit of the cross timbers to the north, but mostly the Edwards Plateau, and it summers and nests in these large cedar breaks that we have. All right, so don't ask me what these guys are because I'm not really an insect person, but this is all pictures of Texas endemic species that are found nowhere else outside of central Texas in the Edward Plateau. And most of these are found only in one spring system. So like maybe Comal Springs in San Marcos, or one of them, there's a couple springs around San Antonio. But we have a lot of arthropods and little spiders that are found in no other spring systems. Along in top right, some of these darters. And we also have about 4 or 5 blind salamander species, which you can see in the top middle, which are found nowhere else in the world. And then we also have some plant species like Texas rice, which is in the bottom right, which is a species of rice, which is found only in the San Marcos River, I believe. So a lot of these species, especially these arthropods and these blind salamanders, they live underground in these caves which have these waters and springs and aquifers in them. So these species are very hard to study because they only come up to surface in large floods where there's a lot of water coming out of the springs. So we really don't know a lot about them, and that's one reason why they're protected. They're also protected because these species depend on the Edwards Aquifer in the underground springs, and that is also the major and only water drinking source for San Antonio, San Marcos, New Braunfels, and a lot of Austin also. So as Texas continues to grow and we pump more and more water out of these springs, it's, are we going to cause these species to go extinct because we're going to run these springs dry? So that's a big conservation concern out there. Because Austin has different sources, but San Antonio is like 99.9% dependent on the Edwards Aquifer for all their drinking water. So the blind salamanders, you can see. Oh, we also have some blind catfish too. I didn't put a picture of them up there. But the blind salamanders are pretty unique. There's a couple of them that we don't even know how far down in the ground they go. Like we don't know if they live several hundred feet down in the aquifer, if they live like 1,000 feet down in the aquifer. We have no idea. There's one species called the Texas blind blanco salamander that we only have one lab specimen from because it came up out of a rock in a big flood about 50 years ago. And since then, we've never seen it again. So there's probably species down in the Edwards Aquifer that we've yet to even discover. So our second to last ecoregion is going to be the South Texas Plains, and that's going to be this orange color down here. And that's basically areas south of San Antonio down towards the Rio Grande Valley and Brownsville and McAllen and Laredo, but west of that Gulf Coast area. And you can see where, far deep South Texas. This is basically a plain, has a variety of soils, very humid in the east, but in the far west part of it gets very dry and arid. So the closer you get to the Gulf, the more humid it gets. But this is that part of the state that hardly ever freezes. You get down into the lower Rio Grande Valley, very warm winters, almost subtropical in nature, has a lot of oil and gas production, long heritage of ranching. So this is where our Keene Ranch is. Historically, it was more of a grassland with very little shrubland. The shrubland was always only like where the fires didn't go. The last pronghorn were actually on the Keene Ranch as late as like the 1940s or 50s. And I mean, we used to have bison and stuff down here not too long ago. But now a lot of that has been converted over to thorn scrub, which we call the Tampico thorn scrub, or slang brush country. And this is that, ever talk to a deer hunter, this is that big white-tailed deer brush country that everybody likes to go hunt in from around the world. But very high and distinct diversity that you see nowhere else, not only in Texas, but really nowhere else in the United States, because we get a lot of northern species reach their northern limits here. So here's some typical pictures of thorn scrub or brush country down in South Texas. Everything down there either bites you. Well, obviously a plant's not going to bite you, but a lot of animals bite you, and the plants either cut you or rip you open. I mean, it's some nasty stuff. Thick, thick, thick. You can see it's kind of rolling hills, but this is what a lot of it looks like. And on the picture on the right, you can see all the different cactuses and mesquite and acacia plants. You could not walk through that. I mean, and that's how most of it is down there. You would get tore up. But surprisingly, these plant species, the variety of plants we have down there in our warm winters, allow for an incredible biodiversity of plants and animals, especially on the animal side. So we see a lot of bird species that you see nowhere else outside of South Texas in the U.S. If I have any birders in the room, y'all know birders flock to this part of the world. But we have such things as the groove-billed Annie, which is on the bottom left. That's that little blackbird. We have the green jay on the bottom right, which is a fan favorite for everybody down there. Very common, but people still love to see the green jays. We have gopher tortoises, which is our only tortoise species in Texas. And then top left is a big old snake, and that's going to be the Texas indigo snake. And you can see it's a very colorful snake. But this is a good snake. Did anybody see what it's eating? They are 100% snake eaters, and their favorite food is rattlesnakes. And so that's what they live. And these Texas indigo snakes can get huge, like 6, 8, 9 feet long. They're big snakes. Very cool looking. All right. So our last ecoregion of the night is going to be, my personal favorite is going to be the Gulf Coastal Plains. So this is going to be that area that extends along the coast, which is obviously influenced by the Gulf of Mexico, which is going to affect our humidity and precipitation. You can see it starts up around Beaumont, just south of the Piney Woods, and then extends down through Houston. Houston's another one of those areas, just like Dallas, Fort Worth, that's really at an intersection between a lot of ecoregions. Harris County alone has both Post Oak, Savannah, Coastal Prairie, and Piney Woods. So Houston's home to 3 different ecoregions. But either way, so when you get just west of Houston, that's the farthest the Gulf Coast Prairie gets out. At that point, it's about 150 miles wide. When you get all the way down south to Corpus, it basically just hugs that coast and is just about a 20 to 30 mile corridor inland. Very good farmland. Historically, it was very flat. It's still flat, but historically it was tall grass coastal prairie. So it had a lot of similar prairie characteristics like the Blackland Prairie of Texas. Very deep soil, so did a lot of good farming. As you know, Houston's a major petrochemical, so along with that is urbanization. We have a lot of oil refineries up and down the coast, so that has had a lot of effect on the ecoregion. Our salt waters are dependent on freshwater inflows for our finfish and our shrimps and crabs. But the Laguna Madre is kind of unique. So the Laguna Madre is that long, narrow bay that extends from Nueces County, which is Corpus Christi, over 100 miles south, all the way down there to Cameron, which is Brownsville. That whole long, narrow bay is the Laguna Madre. And that's a hypersalinity bay. It's actually saltier than the ocean. It's one of the most hypersalinity bays in the world. So it gets no freshwater inflow. So it's saltier than the ocean. But surprisingly, it creates an incredible amount of diversity. And so the Laguna Madre, which a picture of that's going to be the picture top middle, that's eelgrass. So the saltwater, the aquatic vegetation loves the Laguna Madre, and it creates all this great habitat for fish. So some of the best fishing in the Gulf of Mexico is found in the Laguna Madre. So I'll just hit some of the highlights here. Top left is Bartina grass. That's what we see in a lot of our coastal marshes. That's kind of like our coral reefs in Texas. That's where all our little finfish and bait fish go to have babies and survive and grow up. Top right's just pictures of our sand dunes along the Gulf Coast beaches. Bottom left's going to be your tall grass prairie. Bottom middle is going to be the salt grass. So you get a little bit inland from where it doesn't flood from the tides. You get these grasses and plants that aren't too palatable for livestock and wildlife because they're adapted to grow in soils that are somewhat salty, because when we get a storm surge, they get inundated with salt water. And then the bottom right is going to be the Columbia bottomlands, which is going to be that area around Brazoria County, Matagorda County, and parts of Fort Bend County, south of Houston, which has all these big live oak trees, which are very important for migrating birds, because the Columbia bottomlands is the only part of the Gulf of Mexico. It's the only part of the Western Gulf of Mexico where a forest directly touches the Gulf. So as these birds migrate from the eastern seaboard, they go across the Gulf of Mexico and they don't stop. So they're exhausted. And then they get to the Columbia bottomlands and they stay there for a week or two and refill up until they continue further south to Central America. So here's a variety of animals you find in the Gulf Coast. So we have, I'll just start at the bottom. We have skimmers. We have a bunch of waterfowl. That's pintail and redhead ducks. We have orioles, like this Baltimore oriole on the right. A lot of songbirds come through the Gulf of Mexico coastal plains. We have sea turtles that nest on our beaches. We still have some prairie chickens at the Atwater Prairie Chicken National Wildlife Refuge. And top left is one of my favorite ones on this slide, because I didn't know this until I worked down along the coast. We actually have land crabs in Texas. So that's like a Texas blue land crab. And that's in an igloo. They get about 5-6 inches big, and they do not depend on water. They can live up to 10 miles inland, and the only time they go to water is to lay their eggs once a year. Obviously, saltwater, important fisheries. So we have flounder, a bunch of big redfish and drum, sheep's head, croaker, even some cool fish like the blenny on the bottom left. And then the bottom right is the toadfish, which is probably one of the ugliest fishes you can catch in the Gulf of Mexico. But this little thing, don't stick your finger in its mouth, because it makes a living off of crunching on oysters. So it breaks oyster shells in half and then eats the oyster inside. So it can do some damage to your finger if you stuck it in its mouth. So that's all I got. Like I said, I'm gonna send out the slides, because I do have a few more, but it's more stuff if y'all just want to learn on y'all's own time. So the EPA has a really good in-depth map over ecoregions of Texas, and there's a link on the top, and I'll send this out to y'all. But basically, you can see the federal government takes about the 11 ecoregions we had in Texas and divides them up into about 50 sub-ecoregions, because we're just so diverse that we have to really divide our state up. So if you really want to dive into this, you really can. So I kind of zoomed in on Montgomery and Walker County for y'all to basically show y'all that when you go by what the federal definitions of ecoregions are in Texas, that you in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. When you look at Montgomery and Walker County, you actually have 6 different sub-eco regions. So you have you have 3 different eco regions of the piney woods. And y'all can read through this when I pass out the slides if you want to. And then you have the Post Oak Savanna, which touches the western end of Montgomery County. And then you even have a little bit of the Blackland Prairie that just barely comes in around Montgomery. So with that, like I said, I'm going to pass all these out to y'all. So that includes our trip across Texas. And I hope y'all enjoyed it. If y'all got any questions, I'm here. If not, y'all can shoot me an email later.
That was great. Kim had to duck out, so this is Virginia. Thank you. I learned a lot. It was really good.
Yeah, I'll make sure I get those slides to Kim and y'all can
Yeah.
send them out to everybody.
Fantastic. Yeah, you've got a comment in the chat. If you could take us all on a field trip, that would be awesome.
Yeah, I get that quite a bit when I do this one. I've been blessed with my job to be able to travel quite a bit across
Oh
Texas.
yeah,
So
it's fantastic.
a lot of almost 2/3 of the pictures y'all saw were mine. So
That's fantastic. Anybody else have any questions before we sign off? Somebody wants to know where your email is. I assume you'll put it in the, just send it to Kim.
yeah,
and then
I'll type it in
yeah.
the chat real quick.
Okay, that's fantastic. Yeah. While you're doing that, I wanted to remind all the interns that our next session is Thursday, March 21st at 7 p.m. for 2 hours, and we're going to be talking about climate and weather. So you're off for a couple weeks and then back for another Thursday night Zoom. Other than that, I'll give you a minute to put your email in. Okay,
it's in the chat.
There. Okay, yep. And I'll stay on for a few minutes to make sure that everybody can write it down and everything. But thank you again. That was fantastic.
No problem.
All right. See everybody in 2 weeks.
All right. Bye, y'all.
Bye.